Tonight, we're walking through every shadow that has ever fallen across Silent Hill. From the first whispered warnings carved into ancient stone to the final flickering lights of a town that refuses to release its grip on the guilty, this is the exhaustive chronology of one of horror gaming's most enduring and complex mythologies. Settle in. This journey will take us through centuries of accumulated suffering, across multiple timelines and interpretations, deep into the psychological mechanisms that make Silent Hill more than just a geographic location. It's a concept, a state of consciousness, a punishment that waits patiently for those who carry guilt heavy enough to summon its fog. The story of Silent Hill isn't told in neat chronological order through the games. The second game exists largely separate from the main narrative thread involving Alessa and the Order. The fourth ventures into territory that connects only tangentially to the cult's machinations. Western developers later added entries that fans continue to debate as canonical or apocryphal. Comics expanded the mythology in directions that sometimes contradicted established lore. Films reimagined events through a lens that borrowed elements but created its own internal logic. But beneath this fractured release order and scattered media adaptations lies a coherent timeline of events, a through line of suffering that begins centuries before any video game console existed and continues, theoretically, to this day. The town's curse operates according to observable patterns even when specific dates remain ambiguous. The Order's theology evolved through distinct phases, even when documentation is incomplete. Characters' fates interweave even when they never meet, and at the center of it all stands Silent Hill itself, not just a collection of buildings and streets, but a mechanism for processing guilt that has been refined across generations. So let's begin where it all truly starts, with the land itself and the people who first understood its dangerous, sacred nature. The land that listens, pre-colonial Silent Hill, long before European ships crossed the Atlantic, before the town of Silent Hill bore that name or any name recognizable to modern ears. The region surrounding what would later be called Toluca Lake was inhabited by indigenous peoples who recognized something fundamental about this place. The boundary between worlds was thin here. This wasn't superstition born from ignorance. This was observed reality, knowledge accumulated through generations of careful attention to patterns that outsiders would later dismiss as primitive belief. The tribes who called this territory home, particularly those who settled the shores and valleys near the lake, understood that certain places on earth possessed qualities that made them spiritually active. These were locations where the membrane, separating the world of the living from the realm of spirits, grew permeable, where dreams could leak into waking reality, where the dead sometimes lingered instead of moving on to whatever waited beyond. The region that would become Silent Hill was one such place, and the people who lived there for centuries before colonization developed complex protocols for navigating its peculiar nature. They called it by various names depending on which tribal affiliation you consulted. Some referred to it as the place of silent spirits, where voices from the other side could be heard but also contained. Others knew it as the Lake of Reflection, acknowledging how the water seemed to mirror not just the physical world but deeper truths about those who looked into it. The land demanded acknowledgement, required ritual observance, and punished those who violated its protocols with consequences that manifested in observable, physical ways. Specific sites within the region held particular significance. Standing stones marked boundaries that should not be casually crossed. Carved warnings on trees indicated where ceremonies could be safely performed. The lake itself was treated with reverence bordering on fear. Its still waters were understood to preserve everything they touched, to hold memories the way ice holds ancient organisms, keeping past events accessible to the present in ways that defied normal temporal progression. The natives performed rituals at designated times of year when the barriers between worlds grew especially thin. These weren't celebrations exactly, more like maintenance, acts of acknowledgement that kept the spiritual pressure from building to dangerous levels. Offerings were made at specific locations. Songs were sung in languages whose meanings were sometimes lost, even to those who sang them, preserved through pure tradition because the elders insisted the words themselves mattered less than the act of speaking them in the right places at the right times. Stories passed down through oral tradition spoke of what happened when protocols were violated. A hunter who disrespected a sacred site would find himself pursued by something that wore the shape of his prey, but moved with intelligence that animals didn't possess. A woman who entered forbidden ground during menstruation would experience visions that left her unable to distinguish dream from waking for the rest of her life. Children who played too close to certain areas would report seeing other children who looked wrong, who moved in ways that human bodies shouldn't move, who spoke in voices that came from everywhere and nowhere. These weren't metaphors or cautionary tales designed to keep people in line through fear of imaginary consequences. The people who lived here observed genuine patterns. The land responded to human action, particularly to violence, to violation of sacred space, to acts performed with disrespect or malicious intent. It remembered, and what it remembered, it eventually manifested. The lake held particular power in their understanding of this place. Toluca Lake, though they wouldn't have called it by that name, was more than water contained by geography. It functioned as a repository, a living archive that preserved not just physical objects but emotional resonance, spiritual weight, the quality of deaths that occurred in or near its waters. Stories spoke of how the lake showed visions to those who looked into it during the right conditions, not reflections of what was, but glimpses of what might be, what had been, what someone feared or desired. Drownings in the lake were particularly troublesome. The normal protocols for helping spirits transition didn't seem to work properly when someone died in those waters. The drowned lingered, unable or unwilling to move on, their presence detectable by those sensitive to such things. The tribes developed specific rituals for trying to help these trapped spirits find peace, though success was never guaranteed. Some spirits were too confused by the manner of their death, too bound to the location, too influenced by the lake's preserving properties to be easily freed. The spiritual geography they mapped wasn't random. Certain hills generated specific effects. One ridgeline induced prophetic dreams in those who slept near it. A valley tended to amplify grief, making mourning feel unbearable if you lingered there too long. A clearing in what would later become the woods surrounding Silent Hill proper was understood as a place where the dead could be communicated with directly, where the boundary was so thin that careful ritual could allow conversation between worlds, though such communication came with risks, as the dead weren't always who they claimed to be, and things from the other side sometimes tried to use these thin places to cross over. The mother stone, Nakihona, in one of the tribal languages, was perhaps the most significant landmark in their spiritual geography. This massive rock formation in the forest near the lake served as a focal point for ceremonies intended to maintain the balance between worlds. The stone itself was believed to possess awareness, to be not just a marker of power, but an entity in its own right. Offerings were made to the mother stone, songs were sung to it, and on specific occasions, shamans would spend days in its presence, entering trance states that allowed them to perceive the structure of reality in ways that normal consciousness couldn't access. What they learned during these visionary experiences suggested that the land's power predated human habitation of the region. This place had been thin, had been active, long before any tribe settled here. The spiritual mechanics operated according to principles that existed independent of human belief or practice. The rituals they developed weren't creating anything. They were responses to conditions that already existed, attempts to work with forces they couldn't control but could, through careful attention, sometimes direct or appease. When European colonizers first arrived in the region in the late 1600s, they encountered a people who tried to warn them about the land's nature. These warnings were dismissed as primitive superstition, the kind of thing that unenlightened savages believed because they lacked the rational, scientific worldview that Europeans supposedly possessed. The carved warnings were torn down or ignored. The standing stones were moved or destroyed to clear land for farming. The sacred sites were desecrated through sheer ignorance, as colonizers built homes and outbuildings on ground that should have remained untouched. The indigenous people fought back, not just to protect their territory in the traditional sense of land ownership, but to prevent catastrophe. They understood what Europeans didn't. Some places must be left alone, some boundaries must be maintained, and disturbing the wrong location could unleash consequences that would affect everyone, colonizer and colonized alike. But explanations don't translate well across cultures, especially when one culture views the other as inherently inferior, as obstacles to progress that must be removed or converted. The violence that followed was both cause and effect. Colonial aggression triggered indigenous resistance. Indigenous resistance justified, in colonial thinking, even greater violence. Blood soaked into ground that had been carefully maintained for generations. Bodies fell on sacred sites. Dying words became curses, not mere expressions of anger, but deliberate invocations, calls to the forces that dwelled in the thin places, requests that the land itself respond to the violations being committed. And the land did respond. The settlers who survived the conflicts reported phenomena they couldn't explain through their European rationalist frameworks. Tools disappeared from where they'd been left, reappearing in locations no human could have moved them to. Animals behaved strangely, refusing to graze in areas that looked no different from any other field, fleeing from invisible threats. Children spoke of figures in the mist that adults couldn't see, at first dismissed as imagination, then impossible to dismiss when the children's descriptions aligned too perfectly, when multiple unrelated children reported the same impossible things. The fog became permanent. What should have been normal morning mist that burned off by noon instead lingered throughout the day, rolling in from the lake with an unnatural persistence that locals initially attributed to quirks of local geography and weather patterns. But the fog behaved wrong. It moved against wind. It gathered more thickly in specific locations. It seemed to respond to human presence, thickening around certain individuals while leaving others in relative clarity. The settlers pressed forward anyway, driven by economic ambition and the conviction that their way of life represented civilization's triumph over wilderness. They established a town on the shores of Toluca Lake, built structures using timber cut from sacred groves, laid roads across ground that should have remained undisturbed. They named it Silent Hill, some say because of how sound deadened in the perpetual fog. Others claim because of how quiet the place felt, despite the unease it generated, a stillness that suggested something holding its breath rather than genuine peace. What these European settlers didn't understand What they perhaps couldn't understand, given their cosmological assumptions, was that they'd inherited the land's curse. The indigenous people's careful maintenance had kept the spiritual pressure manageable. By destroying those systems without replacing them with anything effective, the colonizers had removed the only controls that existed on forces they didn't believe in, but which operated regardless of belief. Silent Hill was founded on cursed ground not because any supernatural force reached out and placed a malediction on it, but because the ground had always been what it was, a thin place where reality's rules bent, and the people who understood how to navigate that thinness had been driven out or killed, their knowledge dismissed as primitive nonsense by those who would spend the next few centuries learning, through suffering, why that knowledge had mattered. Jennifer Carroll and the Birth of the Order, 1692. Among the early European settlers, one woman recognized what others either missed or deliberately ignored. The land possessed genuine power, and that power could be understood, perhaps even directed toward specific ends. Her name was Jennifer Carroll, and where other colonists saw either nothing unusual or vague unease they attributed to living on the frontier, she perceived patterns, mechanisms, a structure underlying the phenomena that couldn't be dismissed as coincidence or hysteria. Carroll came from a family with history in what colonials called natural philosophy, the precursor to modern science, but still deeply entangled with occult traditions that wouldn't be fully separated from legitimate inquiry for another century. She'd been educated, unusual for a woman of her era, and had read widely in both theological and alchemical texts. When she arrived in the settlement that would become Silent Hill, she recognized immediately that the reports of strange phenomena weren't exaggerations but described real events requiring explanation. She began documenting the patterns. Specific individuals experienced phenomena while others didn't. What determined sensitivity? Certain locations generated effects more reliably than others. What made those sites different? The fog gathered thickly on some days and dispersed on others. What triggered the variations? She interviewed other settlers about their experiences, noted the dates and times of unusual occurrences, and gradually assembled a framework for understanding Silent Hill's peculiar nature. Her conclusions, drawn from observation and synthesized with her readings in European occult traditions, suggested that Silent Hill sat at a nexus point where the physical and spiritual worlds intersected. The land itself possessed properties that amplified certain kinds of psychic energy, that responded to human consciousness in ways that violated normal physical laws, but operated according to their own consistent principles. Most significantly, she determined that sufficient understanding of these principles could allow someone to direct the effects, to use Silent Hill's power rather than merely suffer its random manifestations. Carroll began gathering others who had experienced the unexplainable, those who'd seen figures in fog that shouldn't exist, who'd felt presences in empty rooms, who'd experienced visions or prophetic dreams that later proved accurate. She taught them what she'd learned, helped them understand their experiences not as punishment or madness, but as sensitivity to real phenomena that most people simply couldn't perceive. Together, they began experimenting with techniques for engaging Silent Hill's power deliberately. They mixed what they'd learned from the few surviving indigenous people willing to share knowledge, often misunderstanding or misapplying those teachings, with European occult traditions drawn from texts on ceremonial magic, alchemy, Christian mysticism, and heterodox theological interpretations. The result was a syncretic practice that honored no single tradition purely, but attempted to synthesize understanding from multiple sources. They performed rituals at the Mother Stone, They sought visions through meditation and fasting. They recorded their experiences in journals that would become foundational texts for what would eventually be called the Order. Carol's theology evolved from these experiences. She came to believe that Silent Hill represented a point where the divine could be reached, where the boundaries that separated humanity from higher realms of existence grew thin enough to cross. She interpreted the land's power as evidence of divine presence, rejected the mainstream Christian insistence that God remained distant and unknowable, and developed a doctrine suggesting that proper ritual, sufficient sacrifice, and adequate understanding could allow humanity to bridge the gap, not just to commune with divinity, but to birth it into physical reality. This was heresy by any standard interpretation of Christian doctrine, and Carol knew it. But she believed she'd discovered truth that conventional religion had missed or deliberately suppressed, that the power she'd observed in Silent Hill proved the existence of spiritual mechanics that organized Christianity either didn't understand or had chosen to bury under orthodoxy. She began speaking openly about her beliefs, gathering followers who shared her experiences of the town's unusual nature, and establishing what she considered a truer form of worship based on direct engagement with spiritual forces rather than blind faith in traditional doctrines. The authorities' response was inevitable. In 1692, the same year Salem's witch trials reached their peak of hysteria, Jennifer Carroll was arrested on charges of witchcraft, heresy, and consorting with demons. The trial was brief, the verdict predetermined by a combination of genuine concern about heretical teachings and practical concerns about a woman gathering too much influence outside proper channels. She was sentenced to death by burning, the traditional punishment for witchcraft, the method considered most effective for destroying both body and evil influence. On the day of her execution, Carol faced the flames with a composure that disturbed witnesses. She didn't recant, didn't beg for mercy, didn't scream as the fire consumed her. According to accounts written by those present, she spoke continuously as she burned, words that seemed to be in multiple languages simultaneously, sounds that several witnesses later claimed had physical effects, headaches, nausea, a sense of wrongness that lingered for days. Some interpreted this as proof of her demonic nature. Others, particularly her followers, understood it as final ritual, a working performed with her death as the sacrifice. What happened to Carol's body after the execution remains disputed. Official records indicate she was burned to ash, the remains scattered, but her followers later claimed they'd recovered fragments, bones, that had somehow survived the fire, preserved through means they attributed to the power she'd accessed. These relics became sacred objects within the underground organization that survived her death, treated as connections to her wisdom and power, sometimes incorporated into rituals, always revered as proof that she'd understood truths about Silent Hill that others couldn't grasp. The Order, though it wouldn't be called that for decades yet, didn't die with Carol's execution. If anything, martyrdom strengthened her teaching's hold on believers. They went underground, conducted their practices in secret, maintained their study of Silent Hill's properties, while presenting a facade of conventional Christianity to the increasingly suspicious community. They preserved Carol's journals, copied her writings by hand, and passed down her teachings through generations, adding their own observations and interpretations as they accumulated more experience with the town's mechanisms. Carol was posthumously declared a saint by her followers, honored with a monument bearing the inscription, "What happened here will never be forgotten." The execution that was meant to destroy her influence instead transformed her into foundational mythology. Her burning became symbolic, a parallel to the immolation rituals they would later perform, believing fire to be transformative, that sufficient suffering through flame could achieve the spiritual elevation she described in her writings. Over the following decades and then centuries, what began as Carol's small circle of fellow seekers evolved into a structured organization with hierarchy, doctrine, and expanding influence. They embedded themselves in Silent Hill's infrastructure. They established institutions that gave them access to vulnerable populations. They observed how the town responded to different kinds of suffering, how trauma manifested in the physical world, how guilt could be weaponized. They waited for individuals with the psychic sensitivity necessary to serve as vessels for the divine birth Carol had prophesied. Most significantly, they refined their understanding of Silent Hill's fundamental mechanism. The town didn't just manifest supernatural phenomena randomly. It responded to consciousness, particularly to damaged consciousness, to guilt and trauma and unresolved psychological wounds. It read people who entered it, scanned them for the specific configuration of their inner damage, and generated external manifestations tailored to individual psychology. A person carrying sufficient burden would find that Silent Hill created a custom hell designed specifically for them. Their personal guilt made architectural, their specific traumas given flesh and form. The Order recognized this mechanism as technology that could potentially be directed. If Silent Hill manifested nightmares based on individual psychology, then manipulating someone's psychological state could influence what manifested. If sufficient trauma created specific kinds of phenomena, then generating trauma deliberately might allow them to control the phenomena produced. And if the town's power could be channeled through a properly prepared vessel, someone with natural psychic sensitivity who'd been subjected to the right kinds of conditioning, then perhaps they could use Silent Hill itself as a tool for birthing divinity into the world. This became their central purpose, their holy mission, the project that would drive the Order's activities for the next 3 centuries. They would find the right vessel. They would subject that vessel to the necessary suffering. They would perform the proper rituals. And they would use Silent Hill's unique properties to achieve what Jennifer Carroll had died believing was possible: the birth of God into physical reality, the creation of paradise through sufficient understanding and sacrifice. The Quiet Centuries, Colonial Development and Hidden Influence, 17th to 18th centuries. Between Jennifer Carroll's execution and the events that would transform Silent Hill in the late 20th century, the town developed its surface identity while the Order operated in its depths. To outside observers and casual visitors, Silent Hill was simply another small New England settlement that gradually evolved into a modest resort town. Tourism discovered it in the early 1800s. The lake's scenic beauty attracted families from Boston and New York seeking respite from industrial cities. Hotels were built. An amusement park was constructed along the lake shore. By the turn of the 20th century, Silent Hill had achieved a comfortable reputation as a peaceful lakeside destination where nothing remarkable ever happened. But beneath this veneer of normalcy, patterns continued accumulating. Statistical analyses of records from this period, performed by researchers much later after Silent Hill's reputation had darkened, revealed anomalies that should have concerned authorities but somehow never triggered sustained investigation. The disappearance rate in Silent Hill consistently exceeded surrounding communities by margins too large to attribute to chance. Suicide statistics clustered in ways that defied demographic explanation. Certain families produced children with unusual abilities or conditions at rates suggesting something beyond genetic inheritance. The order flourished during these quiet centuries, growing from Carroll's hunted underground group into an organization with genuine influence over Silent Hill's institutions. This expansion happened gradually through careful placement of members into positions of authority. They didn't attempt to control everything. That would have drawn attention. Instead, they focused on institutions that served their purposes while maintaining a facade of normalcy elsewhere. Alchemilla Hospital became particularly important to their operations. Founded in the mid-1800s initially as a facility to treat tuberculosis and other endemic diseases, Alchemilla gradually shifted focus toward experimental treatments that pushed ethical boundaries even by the looser standards of 19th century medicine. Order members on the hospital staff conducted research into altered states of consciousness, studying how trauma affected the mind, documenting cases of unusual psychic phenomena, and experimenting with substances derived from local plants, particularly white Claudia, a flower that grew in the forests surrounding Silent Hill and possessed psychoactive properties the Order had learned to exploit. White Claudia became central to the Order's practices. The plant was used by indigenous people in certain ceremonies, though colonizers had initially dismissed it as worthless or dangerous. The Order discovered that when properly prepared, White Claudia induced states of consciousness that made people more susceptible to suggestion, more open to perceiving phenomena they would normally dismiss as impossible, more vulnerable to the kind of conditioning the Order wanted to perform on potential vessels. They developed techniques for cultivating the plant in hidden greenhouses, for processing it into various forms, and for administering it in ways that produce specific psychological effects. From White Claudia, Order chemists eventually synthesized PTV, the exact meaning of the acronym remaining unclear. Some sources suggest polyural tranquility virus, others interpret it differently, and the Order themselves may have used multiple names deliberately. PTV was more than a simple drug. When administered properly, it opened what the Order called the inner eye, the ability to perceive the other world directly, to see the manifestations that Silent Hill generated, to exist simultaneously in normal reality and the nightmare realm that lay beneath it. But PTV came with costs. Long-term use destroyed mental stability, created dependencies that were nearly impossible to break, and sometimes triggered psychotic breaks that left users permanently unable to distinguish reality from hallucination. The Order used PTV extensively in their institutions. Alchemilla hospital staff administered it to patients without informed consent, documenting the effects, refining their understanding of proper dosages and administration techniques. Later, they would distribute PTV more broadly, introducing it into Silent Hill's underground drug trade, creating a population of addicts whose altered consciousness made them useful for various Order purposes while also generating the suffering and degradation that fed into Silent Hill's accumulated spiritual pressure. Cedar Grove Sanitarium served similar purposes to Alchemilla Hospital, but focused specifically on mental health. Established in the late 1800s as the region's primary psychiatric facility, Cedar Grove became a dumping ground for individuals considered mad, dangerous, or simply inconvenient to their families. The Order infiltrated its staff early, recognizing that an institution full of people already experiencing psychological distress provided perfect cover for their experiments in consciousness manipulation and trauma generation. Treatment at Cedar Grove often involved techniques that would later be recognized as torture disguised as therapy. Patients were subjected to prolonged isolation in cells that should have been condemned as inhumane. Electroshock therapy was administered at levels that caused permanent damage. Water treatments, prolonged immersion in ice baths, or sustained subjection to high-pressure streams were used both as punishment and purported therapy. All of this suffering was documented in meticulous records that the order preserved for their own purposes, treating human misery as data in their ongoing research into consciousness and how it could be manipulated. During these centuries, the order also established several other key institutions that would become significant in later events. Wish House Orphanage was built in the early 1900s in the forest surrounding Silent Hill, ostensibly as a charitable institution for homeless children, but actually functioning as a recruitment and indoctrination center for the order. Children with no families to investigate their treatment, with no protections beyond what authorities who could be influenced by order members chose to provide, made perfect subjects for the kind of conditioning the cult considered necessary for creating vessels capable of channeling divine power. The orphanage was deliberately isolated, built far enough from town that the screams neighbors occasionally reported hearing could be dismissed as exaggeration or misidentification of animal sounds. The buildings included features that served no legitimate purpose for an orphanage: cells in the basement for punishment, a round tower that locals speculated might be a prison or secret worship site, underground passages leading to other locations in the forest, including the Mother Stone site that the order had claimed as their primary ritual location. Children raised at Wish House were subjected to systematic psychological abuse, designed to break down their sense of self and rebuild them according to order doctrine. They were taught that the outside world was dangerous, that only the order could protect them, that suffering was holy and necessary for spiritual growth. Physical discipline was harsh and frequent. Food was sometimes withheld as punishment. Isolation in dark cells was standard practice for any resistance to authority. And through it all, they were dosed with carefully measured amounts of PTV or white Claudia extract, opening their minds to the order's teachings while making them dependent on substances only the cult could provide. Not every child survived the conditioning. Some broke entirely, their minds fragmenting under the pressure into conditions beyond the order's ability or desire to help. These failures were buried, sometimes literally, in graves scattered through the woods where no authorities would think to search. Others developed the kind of psychotic tendencies that the order couldn't fully control, becoming dangers even to their intended purpose. But enough children emerged from Wish House properly conditioned, belief in the order's doctrine thoroughly embedded, willingness to endure suffering firmly established, psychic sensitivity amplified to useful levels, to make the operation valuable to the cult's long-term goals. The order also developed a complex internal structure during these centuries. What began as a single unified group gradually fractured into sects with different emphases and methodologies while remaining aligned on core goals. These divisions reflected genuine theological disagreements about how divinity should be approached and what methods were most effective for achieving the birth of God they all desired. The sect of the Holy Woman, led by members descended from families close to Jennifer Carroll's original circle, focused on finding female vessels with sufficient psychic power to carry divine seed to term. They interpreted the order's goals through explicitly generative metaphors: pregnancy, birth, motherhood as sacred acts. Their rituals centered on femininity, fertility, and the transformation of suffering into creation. They saw themselves as midwives to divinity, preparing vessels through careful selection and brutal conditioning, ready to help shepherd God's birth when the right circumstances finally aligned. The sect of the Holy Mother operated differently. establishing themselves at Wish House and focusing on long-term cultivation of potential vessels from childhood. They rejected the sect of the Holy Woman's emphasis on mature female vessels, believing instead that proper conditioning needed to begin early, that children's more malleable consciousness could be shaped into the specific configurations necessary for channeling divine power. They were slightly less violent in their methods than some other sects. At least they usually weren't trying to kill their subjects. But their psychological manipulation was perhaps more insidious, installing patterns of thought and behavior so deeply that victims often couldn't imagine existing any other way. The sect of Valtiel served as intermediaries between other sects, devoted to an entity they believed to be the closest angel to God, the executor of divine will in physical reality. Members of this sect wore distinctive red hoods during ceremonies, embodying the role of executioners in service to higher purpose. They didn't typically engage in the long-term vessel preparation that occupied other sects, instead serving as enforcers, maintaining order discipline, carrying out punishments, and performing specific ritual roles in ceremonies that required multiple sect cooperation. These various sects sometimes cooperated, sometimes competed, and occasionally came into genuine conflict over methodology and theology, but they remained united by shared fundamental beliefs that Silent Hill possessed unique power tied to its spiritual geography, that this power could be channeled through properly prepared vessels, that sufficient understanding and sacrifice could achieve the birth of divinity into physical reality, and that such a birth would usher in the paradise that humanity's fall from grace had denied. Through all of this, Silent Hill maintained its surface identity as a peaceful resort town. Hotels welcomed tourists. The amusement park did steady business during warm months. Families took pleasant vacations, boated on Toluca Lake, and returned home with happy memories of scenic views and restful days. The vast majority of visitors experienced nothing unusual beyond perhaps noting that the fog was thicker than they'd expected. That sound seemed to deaden in odd ways, that the town had a peculiar quality they couldn't quite articulate, but which made them slightly uncomfortable in ways they dismissed as imagination. But those carrying sufficient guilt, those haunted by trauma they couldn't resolve, those psychologically damaged in specific ways, these visitors sometimes experienced things that no amount of rationalization could dismiss. They saw figures in the fog that shouldn't exist. They heard sounds that came from nowhere. They experienced the first touches of Silent Hill's phenomenon, the mechanism that would later be understood as the town's fundamental operation. It read damaged consciousness and manifested personalized nightmares based on individual psychology. The Order documented all of this, maintaining meticulous records across generations. They noted which kinds of trauma generated which effects. They observed which personality types proved most susceptible to Silent Hill's influence. They experimented with deliberately placing subjects into scenarios designed to trigger specific psychological responses, then observed what the town manifested in response. All of this research served their ultimate goal of understanding Silent Hill's mechanisms well enough to direct them toward the birth of God their doctrine prophesied. The Gillespie lineage and Dahlia's ascension, 1900 to 1976. By the early 20th century, the Order had become deeply entrenched in Silent Hill's identity, operating through a network of families whose lineages traced back to Jennifer Carroll's original followers. Among these families, the Gillespies occupied a position of particular importance. They'd produced multiple generations of individuals with strong psychic sensitivity. that rare configuration of consciousness that allowed direct perception of Silent Hill's other world without chemical assistance. This sensitivity ran through their bloodline with unusual consistency, making them valuable to the Order's long-term plans, even as it cursed them with awareness of horrors that most people remained mercifully blind to. Dahlia Gillespie was born into this legacy in the 1940s, inheriting both her family's psychic abilities and their fanatical devotion to the Order's doctrine. From childhood, she could see things that others couldn't. The shimmer in the air where reality grew thin. The shapes that moved through fog with purposes that had nothing to do with natural phenomena. The way certain locations seemed to pulse with accumulated suffering. Her family recognized her gifts early and cultivated them deliberately, grooming her for a leadership role within the Order even before she understood what that role would demand. Dahlia's education in the Order's ways was comprehensive and brutal. She was taught their interpretation of theology, their understanding of Silent Hill's spiritual mechanics, their techniques for amplifying psychic sensitivity through ritual and sacrifice. She learned to read the signs that indicated someone carrying the kind of psychological damage that Silent Hill responded to most strongly. She studied the Order's accumulated records, absorbing centuries of observation about how guilt manifested in physical reality, how trauma could be weaponized, how consciousness could be manipulated toward specific ends. By her 20s, Dahlia had become a priestess within the Order, respected for her genuine belief in their doctrine and her practical abilities to manipulate people and situations toward cult goals. Unlike some Order members who participated primarily for social or economic advantage, Dahlia was a true believer. She accepted completely the theology that portrayed suffering as holy, that framed cruelty as necessary service to higher purpose, that promised paradise would be born through sufficient sacrifice. This conviction made her more dangerous than members motivated by mere self-interest. She would do anything, sacrifice anyone, endure any consequence if she believed it served the divine birth she'd been taught to desire above all else. In the late 1960s, Dahlia married a man whose name rarely appears in Order records, suggesting he was either an outsider brought into the cult through marriage or a member deemed relatively unimportant to the events that would follow. The marriage produced a daughter, Cheryl, born in 1969. From the moment of Cheryl's birth, Dahlia recognized something extraordinary in her child's psychic potential. The sensitivity that ran through the Gillespie line had manifested in Cheryl at levels Dahlia had never observed before. This wasn't just the ability to perceive the other world or feel spiritual presence. Cheryl's consciousness seemed to exist partially outside normal reality even as an infant, as if she'd been born already halfway into the realm the Order spent lifetimes trying to access. For Dahlia, this recognition crystallized into terrible purpose. Her daughter wasn't just a child, she was an opportunity, perhaps the vessel the Order had been searching for across centuries of failed attempts. Cheryl's extraordinary psychic sensitivity made her capable of channeling the kind of power necessary for the divine birth that Order theology promised. But actualizing that potential would require specific preparations, deliberate trauma generation, and ultimately a level of sacrifice that most parents would find unthinkable. Dahlia, however, didn't think like most parents. She thought like a priestess whose entire worldview framed her daughter's suffering as holy necessity. The Order's leadership recognized the same potential Dahlia saw. Cheryl Gillespie became the focus of their long-term planning, the vessel they would prepare for the ritual that would finally achieve what Jennifer Carroll had died believing was possible. But there were complications. Cheryl's father objected to the order's intentions for his daughter, creating domestic conflict that threatened to derail the cult's plans. According to fragmented accounts, he attempted to remove Cheryl from Dahlia's custody, to take his daughter away from Silent Hill and the order's influence. This resistance couldn't be tolerated. In 1976, when Cheryl was 7 years old, her father died under circumstances that official records describe as suicide, but which almost certainly involved order intervention. Whether Dahlia participated directly in her husband's death remains unclear, but she certainly benefited from it. With him removed, she had unchallenged authority over Cheryl's fate, complete freedom to prepare her daughter for the role the order intended her to fulfill. But Cheryl, even at 7, possessed unusual awareness of what was happening around her. Her psychic sensitivity meant she could perceive intent, sense the malevolence behind the order's apparent kindness, understand on some level that her mother was preparing her for something terrible. In a desperate act of self-preservation that shouldn't have been possible for a child, Cheryl did something that would complicate the order's plans for more than a decade. She split herself, using psychic abilities she didn't consciously understand how to control, operating on pure survival instinct. Cheryl divided her consciousness into 2 separate entities. One half remained with Dahlia in Silent Hill, the vessel the order needed but now incomplete. The other half was cast out, expelled from Silent Hill entirely, sent across unknown distance to manifest as a physical child far from her mother's reach. This split wasn't metaphorical. Cheryl literally divided her soul, creating 2 beings where one had existed, each carrying part of the original consciousness, each incomplete without the other, neither fully human in ways that normal people would understand. The half that remained in Silent Hill would be renamed Alessa, though she was the same child, or half of the same child. The other half materialized in a distant location where she would be found and raised by someone who had no connection to Silent Hill or the Order, living 7 years of life without memory of her origin, believing herself to be someone she wasn't, unaware that she was a fragment of a consciousness that had been broken by trauma too severe for a child to endure any other way. But the night of Alessa's burning involved more witnesses than just the Order's cultists and their intended victim. A man with no knowledge of Silent Hill's dark history was about to become an unwilling participant in events that would mark him forever. Travis Grady and the Night of the Burning, 1976. On the same night that Dahlia Gillespie subjected her daughter to immolation in 1976, a man with no connection to Silent Hill or the Order found himself pulled into events that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Travis Grady was a trucker, 30-something, driving routes that took him past Silent Hill's boundaries on a regular schedule. He had his own unresolved trauma, a mother institutionalized for attempted murder-suicide when Travis was a child, a father who'd hanged himself unable to cope with his wife's madness, abandonment, and psychological damage that Travis had never properly processed, but he managed his pain through work, through constant movement, through the solitude that long-haul trucking provided. On this particular night, Travis was driving past Silent Hill when something compelled him to deviate from his planned route. He couldn't later articulate what had drawn him. Some witnesses described seeing a girl standing in the road. Others reported that Travis simply turned toward the town as if following instinct he didn't consciously recognize. Whatever the mechanism, Travis found himself driving into Silent Hill proper, navigating streets that seemed wrong even before the full nightmare began, following a pull he didn't understand toward a destination he hadn't chosen. He arrived at the location where Dahlia's ritual was being performed, an isolated building that the Order used for their ceremonies, far enough from populated areas that screams wouldn't attract immediate attention. Travis saw flames through windows, recognized the signs of a structure fire, and responded with the basic human impulse to help. He broke through a door, entered a building that was rapidly becoming an inferno, and found a child in the center of the flames, a 7-year-old girl, Alessa Gillespie, already badly burned, but somehow still alive, consciousness locked in a body that should have died from shock and damage. Travis carried Alessa out of the burning building, got her to relative safety, and tried to provide what first aid his limited knowledge allowed. But before he could get her to a hospital, before he could alert proper authorities, other figures arrived, Order members who'd been participating in the ritual, who understood that Alessa's removal from the fire threatened their plans, who recognized Travis as unwanted interference that needed to be dealt with. They took Alessa from him, claimed authority to handle the situation, and made clear through implied threats that Travis's continued involvement would be dangerous for him. But the brief contact with Alessa had already infected Travis with something he couldn't shake. Her psychic power, amplified by the trauma of burning, had recognized in Travis a consciousness that carried its own damage, someone whose guilt and unresolved trauma made him susceptible to Silent Hill's mechanisms. In the moments when Travis had carried Alessa's burned body, some fragment of her power had transferred to him, not deliberately, but as consequence of direct contact with someone whose abilities were operating at unprecedented intensity, whose suffering was warping reality around her in ways that affected everyone close enough to be touched by it. Travis tried to leave Silent Hill after the order took Alessa. He got back in his truck, attempted to return to his normal route, told himself that what he'd witnessed was someone else's problem and authorities would handle it properly. But he couldn't leave. The roads led back to Silent Hill regardless of which direction he drove. The fog thickened until he couldn't see beyond a few feet, and increasingly Travis began perceiving things that shouldn't exist. Flickers of alternate reality, glimpses of the other world that Alessa's trauma was causing to bleed through into physical space, manifestations that suggested Silent Hill wasn't going to let him leave until he'd served whatever purpose the town needed him for. Over the course of that night, Travis navigated a Silent Hill that was beginning its transformation into the nightmare realm it would fully become by 1983. The other world wasn't yet dominant. Alessa had only just been burned. Her suffering was still accumulating rather than having reached the critical mass that would sustain permanent reality warping. But the mechanisms were already activating. Travis encountered creatures that wore shapes drawn from his own psychology, manifestations suggesting his mother's madness, his father's suicide, the abandonment that had defined his childhood. The town was reading him, scanning his consciousness for trauma, beginning to generate the personalized hell that would force him to confront what he'd spent years avoiding. He also discovered that his brief contact with Alessa had given him an ability he shouldn't possess. Travis could now perceive mirrors as portals between the normal world and the other world, could use them to shift between realities, to navigate spaces that existed simultaneously in multiple states. This wasn't a gift, it was a burden, a curse that came from being touched by Alessa's power at the moment when it was transforming from latent potential into active reality manipulation. Every mirror became a doorway, every reflection a choice about which version of reality to occupy, and Travis found himself trapped in between worlds with no clear understanding of how he'd been given this ability or how to stop using it. Through his navigation of Silent Hill's splitting realities, Travis encountered evidence of the Order's operations. He found Alessa in Alchemilla Hospital's basement, saw the conditions under which she was being kept, understood that what he'd interrupted wasn't just a fire but a deliberate ritual of torture. He encountered other victims of the order, children who'd passed through Wish House, patients at Cedar Grove Sanitarium who'd been subjected to experiments in consciousness manipulation, people whose suffering fed into the accumulated spiritual weight that Silent Hill processed. And he began piecing together that Dahlia Gillespie, the woman who'd claimed authority to take Alessa from him, wasn't trying to help her daughter, but was orchestrating her torment. Travis also witnessed the moment when Alessa split her consciousness, when the 7-year-old girl performed the impossible psychic act that divided her soul into two separate entities. He was present, not physically in the room, but perceiving through the mirror portals, existing in the liminal space between realities, when Cheryl was cast out, when the other half of Alessa's consciousness was expelled from Silent Hill and sent across unknown distance to manifest elsewhere. Travis didn't fully understand what he was witnessing, but he recognized it as significant, as the moment when something fundamental changed in whatever was happening to the burned girl. The Order recognized Travis as both threat and potential tool. Dahlia attempted to manipulate him, to convince him that interfering further would doom Alessa rather than save her, that the ritual they were performing served necessary purposes he couldn't comprehend. Other Order members tried to kill him, viewing him as witness who knew too much and hadn't been properly conditioned to maintain silence. And some cultists saw Travis's mirror ability as evidence that he'd been chosen by the forces they worshipped, that his involvement was an accident but divine plan, that he should be recruited rather than eliminated. Travis rejected the Order's theology completely. He'd grown up with a mother who heard voices and saw things that weren't there, had watched mental illness destroy his family, and recognized the Order's beliefs as rationalized madness rather than genuine spiritual truth. Whatever power Alessa possessed, whatever was happening in Silent Hill, Travis understood it as trauma weaponized rather than divinity manifesting. He refused to cooperate with the Order's plans, fought against their attempts to constrain him, and focused on a single goal: getting out of Silent Hill and taking Alessa with him if possible. But Alessa couldn't be saved through direct intervention. Her body was too damaged, her consciousness too fragmented by the split, her role in the Order's plans too central for them to allow her removal, even if Travis could physically accomplish it. The best Travis could do was disrupt the ritual enough to give Alessa more time, to create conditions where her resistance might eventually succeed, to ensure that the Order's plans didn't proceed as smoothly as they'd anticipated. By the time Travis finally escaped Silent Hill, driving away in the early morning hours after a night that had lasted far longer than clocks suggested, he carried permanent marks from his exposure. The ability to perceive mirrors as portals remained, appearing sporadically for the rest of his life, unwanted reminders of what he'd experienced, memories of the creatures he'd fought, the realities he'd navigated, the burning girl he'd failed to save. All of it stayed with him, adding new layers to the trauma he'd been carrying since childhood. And he knew that Silent Hill existed as something more than normal town, that the supernatural was real, and that he'd been pulled into events whose full consequences he couldn't predict, but which clearly weren't finished. Travis's involvement in the 1976 event served several purposes in the broader timeline. His rescue of Alessa from the initial fire, however briefly, had disrupted the Order's ritual at a critical moment, potentially altering how Alessa's power developed or how her consciousness responded to the trauma. His presence as witness meant that someone outside the Order knew what had happened, carried evidence that couldn't be entirely suppressed even if Travis himself couldn't prove what he'd seen. And his infection with the mirror ability demonstrated that Alessa's power could transfer to others through direct contact, that exposure to her trauma at peak intensity could fundamentally alter someone else's relationship with reality. The order let Travis leave Silent Hill, calculating that killing him would draw more attention than allowing him to survive, with memories that no one would believe if he tried to share them. They were partially correct. Travis never reported what he'd experienced, recognizing that describing burning children and mirror portals and reality shifting would get him institutionalized like his mother had been. But the order underestimated how Travis's witness to their operations might influence future events, how his knowledge might become relevant years later when other forces moved against the cult, how the guilt he carried from failing to save Alessa might make him susceptible to returning to Silent Hill in ways they hadn't anticipated. Travis continued working as a trucker, driving routes that deliberately avoided Silent Hill for years afterward, trying to forget what he'd experienced but never fully succeeding. The mirrors continued showing him things he didn't want to see, glimpses of otherworld bleeding through into normal reality, manifestations that suggested Silent Hill's influence extended beyond its boundaries through people like him who'd been marked by exposure. And he wondered about the girl he'd pulled from the fire, whether she'd survived, what had become of her, whether his intervention had helped or merely prolonged suffering that should have ended more mercifully in the flames. He wouldn't learn the full truth of what his actions had contributed to until much later, if ever. Travis was a footnote in events that centered on Alessa and Harry and eventually Heather, a witness whose perspective clarified certain details but didn't change fundamental outcomes. But his story demonstrated that Silent Hill's influence touched more people than just those who carried guilt severe enough to generate sustained manifestations. Sometimes the town pulled in bystanders, infected them with fragments of its power, and sent them back into the world carrying marks that would never fully fade, witnesses to trauma they hadn't caused but could never escape having observed. The burning of Alessa and the long nightmare, 1976 to 1983. Dahlia's reaction to discovering that Cheryl had split herself was pragmatic rather than emotional. She'd lost half of the vessel she'd been grooming, but the half that remained still carried sufficient power to serve the Order's purposes. If Dahlia could prevent any further escape attempts and complete the preparations that had been interrupted, the solution she arrived at was as brutal as it was effective. If Alessa tried to leave again, if she attempted any further acts of self-preservation that might interfere with the cult's plans, Dahlia would ensure her daughter couldn't move, couldn't act, could barely even think beyond the constant, overwhelming sensation that would occupy her entire consciousness. On a date that records don't precisely specify, but which Alessa herself would later describe as occurring when she was 7, meaning sometime in 1976, shortly after the split, Dahlia orchestrated what would become the central trauma around which the entire original Silent Hill timeline revolved. She brought Alessa to an isolated location, likely one of the Order's ritual sites, and there subjected her daughter to immolation. The burning wasn't an accident, wasn't punishment that went too far, wasn't a purification ritual that was only meant to symbolize transformation. It was calculated torture, designed to inflict maximum agony while keeping the victim alive, performed specifically to generate the suffering that Dahlia believed would amplify Alessa's psychic abilities to the level necessary for channeling divine power. The Order's theology framed this as holy necessity. Alessa's pain would birth God, her agony would bring paradise, her suffering served a purpose beyond merely personal experience. But beneath the theological justification, what happened was a mother burning her child alive for the sake of an ideology that promised the impossible. The fire consumed Alessa's body, charring flesh, destroying her ability to move or speak or do anything but exist in a state of perpetual torment. By rights, she should have died within minutes, shock and damage overwhelming her body's capacity to sustain life. But Alessa didn't die, couldn't die. Her extraordinary psychic abilities, amplified by the very trauma Dahlia had inflicted, wouldn't allow it. She held herself in a state between life and death, neither fully in the world nor able to leave it. Consciousness locked inside a ruined body that couldn't heal but somehow remained alive. The order had Alessa transferred to Alchemilla Hospital, where they could maintain her condition indefinitely while preparing for the next phase of their plan. She was placed in the hospital's basement, hidden from casual observation, attended only by staff who were either order members or had been coerced into silence. Medical intervention kept her body functional, fluids, nutrients, whatever was necessary to prevent complete physical death, but no attempt was made to ease her pain. The suffering was the point. Her agony served as fuel for what the order intended to accomplish. Alessa existed in this state for 7 years, from 1976 to 1983, experiencing every moment of those years with the clarity that her psychic sensitivity wouldn't allow her to escape through unconsciousness or madness. She felt every nerve ending that the fire hadn't destroyed. She existed in continuous awareness of her body's ruined state, and she was aware, always aware, of her mother's betrayal, of the order's intentions, of the fact that this torture was deliberate and would continue as long as they needed it to. But Alessa wasn't passive in her suffering. The same psychic abilities that prevented her from dying also gave her tools that the order had underestimated. Her consciousness, locked in a body that couldn't move, learned to move in other ways. She could reach out through the other world that her sensitivity allowed her to perceive directly, could manipulate the nightmare realm that existed beneath Silent Hill's normal reality, could affect physical space through pure will exercised across the boundaries between worlds. The town began changing in response to Alessa's accumulated suffering. Silent Hill's mechanism, that fundamental operation that manifested nightmares based on psychological damage, had never before encountered someone with Alessa's combination of psychic power and absolute trauma. Her pain was so intense, so sustained, so completely unresolvable that Silent Hill itself began to warp around it, the other world that normally existed as a parallel space accessible only to those with specific sensitivity started bleeding through into physical reality. Fog rolled in from the lake with unprecedented thickness and persistence. Sounds took on qualities that shouldn't be possible. Screams heard from empty buildings, metal scraping against metal in the absence of any metal objects, sirens wailing warnings about disasters that hadn't occurred. The order recognized these changes as evidence that their plan was working. Alessa's suffering was generating effects of unprecedented magnitude, warping reality in ways that suggested the barrier between worlds was weakening. They interpreted this as progress toward their ultimate goal. The condition of reality was shifting toward a state where divine birth became possible, where God could be brought into physical existence through a vessel prepared by sufficient sacrifice. But Alessa's consciousness wasn't being directed toward the order's purposes despite their intentions. She was using the connection they'd forced upon her between her suffering and Silent Hill's responsive power for her own desperate goal, calling out to the other half of herself, the fragment of consciousness she'd cast away during the original split, trying to summon that other half back to Silent Hill. She didn't consciously understand her plan. She operated on instinct, on the fundamental drive toward wholeness that any divided thing experiences, on the recognition that if she could reunite with her other half, she might have enough combined strength to resist what Dahlia and the Order were forcing upon her. During these 7 years, The Order also implanted something into Alessa's womb, or rather, they implanted a fetal vessel that they intended to use for the birth of their god. The exact mechanics of this implantation remain unclear, mixing as they did biological procedure with occult ritual, technological intervention with spiritual manipulation. What's certain is that Alessa was forced to carry what the Order called the seed of God, a developing entity that was neither quite human nor entirely supernatural, something that existed partially in physical reality and partially in the other world that Alessa's consciousness could access. The incubation of this entity caused Alessa even more suffering than the burns themselves, an escalation of agony that seemed impossible given what she already endured. The thing growing inside her wasn't a normal pregnancy. It fed on her pain, drew power from her psychic energy, and seemed to be aware of her resistance, actively fighting against her attempts to prevent its development. Alessa found herself engaged in a psychological battle with the entity the Order had forced upon her, struggling to contain it, to prevent it from achieving the kind of consciousness that would allow it to birth itself into reality using her as a vessel. By 1983, 7 years into this nightmare, multiple forces had been set in motion that would converge in ways the Order hadn't fully anticipated. Alessa's call to her other half was finally being heard across the distance that separated them. The entity in her womb was nearing a critical stage of development that would soon require action from the Order, and Silent Hill itself had been transformed by years of sustained exposure to Alessa's trauma, warped into a place where the other world could manifest with unprecedented clarity and violence. The Order prepared for what they believed would be their moment of triumph, the completion of the incubation, the birth of divinity, the paradise that their doctrine promised would follow. But they'd made critical miscalculations. They'd underestimated Alessa's will to resist. They'd failed to account for what might happen if her split consciousness reunited, and they hadn't anticipated that her call for help might be answered by someone with no connection to the Order, no investment in their goals, and no reason to cooperate with their plan. Harry Mason and the First Silent Hill Incident, 1983. Harry Mason was an ordinary man living an ordinary life far from Silent Hill, with no knowledge of occult forces, no psychic sensitivity to speak of, and no reason to believe that anything beyond the material world existed. He was a writer by trade, moderately successful, recently widowed when his wife died, in circumstances unrelated to Silent Hill's strangeness. The loss devastated him, but through his grief emerged an opportunity for something that gave his life renewed purpose: adoption. In early 1983, through an adoption agency whose records would later prove difficult to verify, Harry adopted a 7-year-old girl named Cheryl Mason. The child had been found years earlier in circumstances that the agency couldn't or wouldn't fully explain. Just a young girl, alone, with no memory of where she'd come from or who her original parents might be. Harry didn't care about the mysteries of her origin. He saw a child who needed a parent, and he needed someone to parent, and the connection between them felt genuine and immediate. What Harry didn't know, what he had no way of knowing, was that Cheryl wasn't a normal child. She was half of Alessa Gillespie's consciousness, the fragment that had been cast out 7 years earlier when a 7-year-old girl in Silent Hill performed an impossible act of psychic self-preservation. Cheryl had lived those 7 years believing herself to be whoever she thought she was, with no conscious memory of Silent Hill, no awareness of the other half of her consciousness that remained trapped in Alchemilla Hospital's basement, no understanding that she was incomplete in ways that normal humans weren't. But as Cheryl approached her 14th birthday, 7 years after the split, 7 years into Alessa's burning, the connection between the two halves of this divided consciousness began pulling at Cheryl with increasing force. She experienced dreams she couldn't explain, visions of places she'd never been, sensations of pain that had no physical cause. Alessa's call across the distance between them was becoming impossible to ignore, dragging at Cheryl's consciousness with a strength that increased daily. In late 1983, Harry noticed Cheryl's behavioral changes, the nightmares, the way she sometimes seemed to be looking at things that weren't there, her growing insistence that they needed to go somewhere, though she couldn't articulate where. Concerned for his daughter's well-being, Harry decided that a vacation might help, time away from familiar surroundings that might be contributing to her distress. When Cheryl suggested Silent Hill, a name that had appeared in her dreams, a place she felt compelled toward, Harry agreed, seeing no reason to refuse and hoping that indulging this fixation might help resolve whatever was troubling her. They drove toward Silent Hill in late December, Harry at the wheel, Cheryl in the passenger seat, both unaware that they were approaching a town that had been warped by 7 years of sustained trauma into something that barely resembled normal reality. As they neared the town limits, Cheryl's behavior became increasingly erratic. She spoke about feeling pulled, about sensing someone calling for her, about recognizing things she'd never seen. Harry, alarmed, but still attributing this to some kind of breakdown, tried to reassure her while navigating roads that seemed wrong, turns that led places they shouldn't, distances that didn't match what maps suggested, fog rolling in with unnatural thickness that reduced visibility to almost nothing. What happened next remained subject to interpretation, with multiple witnesses reporting contradictory details and physical evidence insufficient to confirm any single version. According to Harry's later accounts, a figure appeared in the road ahead, a girl or something wearing a girl's shape, standing impossibly still in the fog. Harry swerved to avoid hitting her, lost control of the vehicle, and crashed through a guardrail. The impact should have been fatal, but both he and Cheryl survived with injuries less severe than they should have sustained. When Harry regained consciousness, Cheryl was gone. The car was damaged but not destroyed, positioned at an angle that suggested the crash had been less violent than he remembered, and the world around him had changed in ways that defied rational explanation. The fog that had been merely thick now seemed to possess depth and movement that fog shouldn't have, as if it were alive, watching. Sounds came from directions that made no geometric sense. When Harry looked toward Silent Hill proper, the town he could see through gaps in the fog appeared simultaneously real and wrong. Its buildings solid, but somehow displaced, existing at angles to reality that his mind struggled to process. Harry entered Silent Hill searching for Cheryl, operating on parental desperation rather than understanding, having no framework for what he was encountering, but driven by the single purpose of finding his daughter. He had no way of knowing that Cheryl had been pulled by Alessa's call, drawn through mechanisms that operated independent of physical location toward the hospital basement where her other half had been suffering for 7 years. He had no context for understanding that the town he was entering existed in a state of sustained, otherworld manifestation. That reality here had been so thoroughly warped by trauma that the nightmare realm normally hidden beneath surfaces had become the dominant condition. The Silent Hill that Harry navigated was fundamentally different from the resort town it had once been. Streets led in directions that defied mapping. Buildings contained geometries that shouldn't exist in three-dimensional space. Creatures moved through the fog, things that wore the shapes of insects, of skinned animals, of children twisted into forms that suggested both vulnerability and violence. These weren't hallucinations, weren't delusions born from Harry's shock. They were real entities that had manifested in response to Alessa's trauma, projections from the other world that her psychic power had given physical form, monsters born from a child's perception of the threats around her. Harry also encountered other people, or what appeared to be other people, moving through Silent Hill with their own agendas and varying degrees of understanding about what was happening. Sybil Bennett, a police officer from a neighboring town who'd entered Silent Hill to investigate reports of unusual activity and now found herself trapped in a nightmare that her training hadn't prepared her for. Dahlia Gillespie, who recognized Harry as a tool she could potentially manipulate toward order goals. Michael Kaufman, a doctor from Alchemilla Hospital with his own secrets and connections to the town's corruption. Lisa Garland, a nurse who'd been forced to care for Alessa and was now trapped in a state between life and death, existing as a manifestation that was part memory, part ghost, part punishment for her complicity in the Order's atrocities. Through these encounters and his own exploration, Harry began piecing together fragments of truth. A girl named Alessa existed somewhere in the town. This girl had been burned 7 years ago, was being kept alive under terrible conditions, and possessed power that was responsible for the nightmare transformation of Silent Hill. Alessa was connected to Cheryl somehow, the connection's exact nature unclear to Harry, but the relationship undeniable given his daughter's drawings that depicted scenes from Alessa's life, her knowledge of things she shouldn't know, and the fact that her disappearance had brought him to this specific horror. Dahlia, recognizing that Harry's search for Cheryl could be directed toward order purposes, manipulated him into helping complete a ritual that would supposedly save the town from the nightmare it had become. She framed herself as trying to stop Alessa's rampage, convinced Harry that collecting specific talismans and placing them at ritual sites would seal away the dark power that a disturbed girl had unleashed. Harry, desperate and out of his depth, cooperated with what Dahlia told him, having no way to recognize that he was being used to complete the very ritual that would allow the Order to birth the god entity that Alessa had been forced to carry. But Alessa had her own plans, developed through 7 years of continuous consciousness trapped in a body that couldn't move. When Harry's actions completed the ritual circle that Dahlia had orchestrated, when the final seal was placed and the barriers holding back the god entity began to fail, Alessa made her move. She'd been waiting for this moment, had endured her mother's manipulations and the Order's torture specifically so she could access the instant when the thing inside her was most vulnerable to her resistance. In the critical moment between containment and birth, Alessa used every fragment of power she'd accumulated to split the entity, to divide what was emerging the way she'd once divided her own consciousness. The result was twins, or rather two manifestations of what should have been a single divine entity, now separated into distinct beings, each incomplete, neither possessing the full godlike power that the Order had intended to birth. One infant was more human, carrying less of the supernatural essence. The other was the vessel for the remainder, still dangerous, but no longer the apocalyptic force that Dahlia had worked toward for 7 years. In the chaos of this moment, reality fragmenting under the stress of an aborted divine birth, the other world's manifestation reaching peak intensity, the Order's carefully constructed plan collapsing, several things happened in rapid succession that would determine Silent Hill's fate for years to come. Dahlia was killed, though accounts differ on whether this was Harry's direct action. Alessa's revenge manifesting through otherworld manipulation, or simply the cosmic backlash from a ritual that failed at its critical juncture. The god entity that had been forced into physical existence began dying. Its incomplete birth ensuring it couldn't sustain itself in material reality, and Alessa, finally free from the burden she'd been forced to carry, made one final psychic effort. She reunited with Cheryl, not physically at first, but in consciousness, the two halves of the original split finally merging after 7 years of separation. The reunification was traumatic, two distinct lives and memories collapsing into a single awareness, but it also gave the combined entity enough power to act decisively. The reunified Alessa Cheryl consciousness, using the last fragments of strength it could muster, gave the more human of the two infants to Harry Mason, trusting that the man who'd raised one half of her would protect this child that carried fragments of her essence but wasn't identical to either original personality. The infant was named Heather by whoever, Harry, the reunified consciousness, or some combination, decided on the name in those final moments. As Harry fled Silent Hill with the baby, the town began collapsing around him. Alessa's death, for she did finally die, released from the torment that had kept her alive for 7 years, removed the psychic anchor that had been holding Silent Hill in a state of sustained, otherworld manifestation. Reality began reasserting itself, but not cleanly. The damage was too severe, the trauma too deeply embedded in the town's spiritual architecture. Silent Hill would never return to what it had been before 1976. It had been permanently altered, transformed into a location where the barrier between worlds remained dangerously thin. Harry escaped with Heather, drove away from Silent Hill as fast as his damaged vehicle could manage, and never looked back. Behind him, the town burned, not literally, though some parts did catch fire in the chaos, but Silent Hill burned in the sense of being consumed by forces it had generated, transformed by trauma into something that could never be undone, permanently scarred by the events that Dahlia's ambition had triggered. The resort town that once welcomed tourists was gone. What remained was a place too dangerous for normal habitation, avoided by those who understood what had happened there, accessible only to those drawn by forces they didn't understand or couldn't resist. The order, meanwhile, suffered a catastrophic setback, but wasn't destroyed. Dahlia was dead, but the cult had existed for 3 centuries through worse crises than losing a single priestess. Many members had died during the collapse that followed the failed birth, killed by otherworld manifestations that turned on them when Alessa's controlling influence faltered, or simply consumed by the chaos they'd helped create. But others survived, scattered through Silent Hill and beyond, preserving the Order's doctrine and beginning the work of rebuilding toward whatever their next attempt might be. And somewhere carried in Harry Mason's arms as he drove away from the horror he'd survived, Heather began her first night of existence, an infant who wasn't quite human, who carried within her fragments of consciousness and power that shouldn't exist in material reality, who was both a more benign twin from an aborted divine birth and a vessel for the reunified soul of a girl who'd been tortured for 7 years. She was innocent in the ways that mattered, not responsible for the circumstances of her creation, deserving of the chance at normal life that Harry was determined to give her. But she was also marked, branded by her origin in ways that would eventually pull her back into Silent Hill's orbit, draw her toward completion of stories that hadn't finished when the town collapsed around Harry's escape. The aftermath and hidden years, 1983 to 1999. Harry Mason rebuilt his life in the aftermath of his Silent Hill experience, focusing on a single overriding purpose: giving Heather as normal an existence as possible despite her extraordinary origin. He understood, perhaps better than he wanted to acknowledge, that his daughter wasn't entirely human in the conventional sense. She was too aware for an infant, developed too quickly in some ways, and occasionally displayed signs of abilities that suggested the supernatural essence she carried. But Harry chose to treat these manifestations as challenges to be managed rather than aberrations to be feared or rejected. He kept extensive documentation of the Silent Hill incident, maintaining journals that recorded everything he could remember about what had happened, who he'd encountered, and what he'd learned about Alessa's ordeal. These records served multiple purposes: processing his own trauma, preserving information that might prove necessary if the Order came looking for Heather, and creating a resource that Heather herself might need if her origin ever became relevant to her life. Harry sealed these journals in locations he didn't share even with Heather, protection against discovery by the wrong people, but accessible if she ever needed them. The years that followed were characterized by Harry's paranoia that manifested as hypervigilance rather than dysfunction. He moved frequently, never staying in one location long enough to establish the kind of patterns that might make them easy to track. He used false names on official documents, obtained identification through less than legal channels, and taught Heather from a young age that their need for secrecy wasn't arbitrary but essential for survival. This rootless existence was difficult for both of them, but it kept them ahead of any Order members who might be searching. Heather grew up aware that her family situation was unusual, but not fully understanding why. Harry had told her that her mother died when she was very young, that they moved frequently because of his work, that the precautions he took were necessary without fully explaining what they were necessary against. She accepted these explanations with the trust that children give parents, though, as she grew older, questions began accumulating that Harry's vague answers didn't satisfy. During these hidden years, Heather displayed signs of her supernatural heritage in ways that Harry learned to recognize and help her conceal. She had nightmares more intense than normal bad dreams, visions that seemed to show real places and events rather than imagination. She occasionally knew things she shouldn't know, facts about people she'd just met, awareness of events that hadn't happened yet, understanding of concepts she'd never studied. Her physical development followed patterns that weren't quite normal, healing from injuries faster than expected, rarely getting sick, manifesting endurance and strength that exceeded what her size and apparent fitness suggested. Harry also observed that places responded to Heather's emotional state in subtle ways. When she was particularly distressed, rooms felt colder, electronics malfunctioned, and animals behaved strangely. These effects were never dramatic enough to attract outside attention, but they confirmed to Harry that his daughter carried power she couldn't fully control, that the fragment of divinity inside her remained active even if suppressed. He worked to help her develop control, teaching meditation techniques, encouraging her to notice patterns in her own emotional states, helping her understand that managing her feelings wasn't just healthy psychology but practical necessity. Meanwhile, Silent Hill itself remained in a state of sustained wrongness. The town never recovered from the events of 1983, never returned to its previous identity as a tourist destination. Some residents who'd survived the nightmare refused to speak about what they'd experienced, maintaining silence born from either trauma or threats. Others abandoned the town entirely, relocating to distant locations where they hoped the memories might fade. The population dwindled to a fraction of what it had been, with only the most stubborn or deluded choosing to remain in a place that felt fundamentally unwelcoming to normal life. The fog never fully cleared after 1983. It remained a Silent Hill's defining characteristic, rolling in from Toluca Lake with persistence that meteorologists couldn't explain through natural causes. The town existed in perpetual twilight even during daytime hours, sunlight diffused by moisture in the air to a hazy glow that never provided full visibility. Visitors reported feeling watched, experiencing unease that intensified the longer they remained, hearing sounds that seemed to come from nowhere, screams, sirens, scraping metal, echoing through streets where no visible source existed. The Order maintained its presence in Silent Hill through this period, though diminished and forced into even deeper secrecy than before. Dahlia's death had created a leadership vacuum that resulted in internal conflict as various sects competed for authority. The sect of the Holy Woman, having lost their most prominent priestess, saw their influence decline. The sect of the Holy Mother, operating from Wish House, suffered when authorities finally investigated the orphanage following anonymous reports and shut it down, discovering evidence of abuse that resulted in arrest of several staff members. The sect of Valtiel continued operating in the shadows, patient as always, confident that the cosmic forces they served would eventually provide another opportunity. The surviving Order members understood that Heather existed somewhere beyond Silent Hill, that she carried within her both the reunified Alessa Cheryl consciousness and the remnant divinity from the failed birth. They searched for her through those 16 years, using resources that combined conventional investigation with occult means of tracking. They monitored adoption records, followed Harry Mason's trail through his documented movements before he learned to hide effectively, and waited for any sign that would reveal the girl's location. They knew that as Heather aged, as she approached maturity, the power inside her would become more active, harder to conceal, and eventually would draw her back towards Silent Hill regardless of Harry's efforts to keep her away. During this period, Silent Hill also attracted other victims, people carrying guilt sufficient to trigger the town's mechanism for manifesting personalized nightmares. These individuals would arrive in Silent Hill for reasons they often couldn't articulate, drawn by forces they didn't understand, and find themselves trapped in custom hells generated by their own psychological damage. Most of these visitors never left. They died in Silent Hill, consumed by manifestations their guilt had summoned, their bodies absorbed into the town's accumulated spiritual weight. Some of these individual tragedies would be documented in later games, exploring different characters' relationships with Silent Hill. But during the hidden years between Harry's escape and Heather's eventual return, these events occurred without witness, without external awareness, just Silent Hill continuing its function as a mechanism for processing guilt through manifestation of personalized suffering. By 1999, 16 years after Harry had fled Silent Hill with infant Heather, several factors were converging toward crisis. Heather was approaching her 17th birthday, the age when the power inside her would reach its first peak of activity. Harry's ability to keep them hidden was deteriorating, as Heather's increasing independence made complete control of their movements impossible. And the Order, patient through years of searching, had finally identified their location through a combination of mundane detective work and ritual divination that pinpointed consciousness with Heather's unique signature. The stage was set for Heather's return to Silent Hill, for the completion of stories that had been interrupted by Alessa's resistance and Harry's escape, for the final confrontation between the power of a reunified consciousness and the Order's determination to use that power for their own purposes. Harry knew this confrontation was coming. He'd spent 16 years preparing Heather as best he could, teaching her to survive, hoping it would be enough. Heather was about to discover that everything she'd been told about her origin was incomplete, that her life had always been shaped by forces she'd been protected from understanding, and that Silent Hill was waiting for her return with the patience of something that existed outside normal time. The order was ready. Silent Hill was ready. And though Heather didn't know it yet, though she still believed herself to be simply Harry Mason's adopted daughter, trying to live a normal life despite their unusual circumstances, she was ready too. The power inside her, suppressed through childhood, was awakening. The memories she'd been shielded from were beginning to surface, and the call that had once pulled Cheryl toward Alessa across impossible distance was reversing, pulling Heather back toward Silent Hill with a force that no amount of precaution could permanently resist. What came next would be Heather's story to live, or to survive, depending on how much of Harry's preparation proved sufficient, and how much of Alessa's resistance had truly transferred to the reunified consciousness now inhabiting a 17-year-old girl who'd never asked to be born from trauma, who'd never chosen to carry power that made her a target, and who would soon learn that sometimes the only way to escape your origin is to return to it and face everything you were never supposed to survive. Heather's Awakening and Claudia's Plan, 1999 to 2000. By 1999, Heather Mason had reached 17 years old without fully understanding the truth of her existence. She knew Harry was paranoid, knew they moved frequently for reasons he wouldn't completely explain, knew there were things about her family history that didn't add up. But she'd accepted these mysteries as the price of their relationship, trusting that whatever Harry was protecting her from must be serious enough to justify the precautions, even if he wouldn't share details. The power inside her had been growing throughout adolescence, becoming harder to ignore and more difficult to control. The nightmares intensified, no longer abstract fears, but specific visions of places she'd never been, people she'd never met, suffering she hadn't experienced but somehow remembered. Objects around her responded to her emotional state more dramatically than before. When she was angry, lights flickered. When she was frightened, temperatures dropped noticeably. And increasingly, she experienced moments of doubled awareness, as if two sets of memories occupied the same consciousness, two different lives overlapping in ways that suggested she was somehow both Heather and someone else simultaneously. Harry recognized these signs as indicators that Heather's power was approaching a critical threshold. The fragment of divinity she carried, suppressed through childhood, was asserting itself as she matured. The reunified Alessa Cheryl consciousness was surfacing, breaking through whatever barriers had kept those memories contained. And most concerning, Harry began noticing signs that they were being watched. Glimpses of figures who disappeared too quickly, cars that appeared in their neighborhood repeatedly, the feeling of being tracked that his years of paranoia had taught him to recognize as genuine threat rather than imagination. The Order had found them. After 16 years of searching, combining mundane detective work with ritual techniques for tracking supernatural signatures, they'd finally pinpointed Heather's location. But the cult had changed in the years since Dahlia's death. New leadership had emerged, and with it came refined theology and adjusted methodology. They'd learned from the failures of 1983, recognized what had gone wrong with Dahlia's approach, and developed what they believed was a better strategy for achieving the divine birth their doctrine promised. Claudia Wolfe had risen to prominence within the Order during the years Harry and Heather spent hiding. She was younger than Dahlia had been, but no less devoted to the cult's theology. If anything, her belief was more intense, purified by observation of how Dahlia's methods had failed, and determination not to repeat those mistakes. Claudia had been a child during the events of 1983, young enough to have experienced the trauma of that year's chaos, but not directly responsible for the failures that occurred. She'd spent the subsequent 16 years studying the Order's accumulated knowledge, developing her understanding of Silent Hill's mechanisms and formulating a plan that she believed would succeed where Dahlia had failed. Claudia's theology differed from Dahlia's in significant ways. Where Dahlia had focused on preparing a vessel through brutal trauma generation and then forcing divine birth through ritual compulsion, Claudia believed that the vessel must choose to birth God, must willingly accept the role, must understand the purpose their suffering served. She'd concluded that Alessa's resistance had been the critical flaw in Dahlia's plan. A vessel fighting against its purpose would always find ways to sabotage the process, would use whatever power they possessed to prevent the birth rather than facilitate it. But a willing vessel, one who embraced their role, who understood that their pain would bring paradise, such a vessel would be unstoppable. And Claudia believed she could make Heather willing, not through torture, that had been Dahlia's mistake, but through psychological manipulation, through demonstrating the world's suffering and convincing Heather that only divine intervention could end it, through positioning the birth of God as an act of compassion rather than cosmic horror. If Heather could be made to see herself as humanity's savior rather than a victim of cult manipulation, she might accept the pregnancy, carry it to term willingly, and birth the paradise that the order had sought for centuries. To accomplish this, Claudia needed Heather in Silent Hill, needed her exposed to the town's reality-warping properties, needed her surrounded by manifestation of suffering that would break down her resistance and make her receptive to the order's message. She also needed Heather separated from Harry, whose protection had kept her stable for 16 years, and whose presence would continue to anchor her against the order's influence. In early 2000, Claudia's agents made their move. Harry Mason was killed in his home, murdered by a creature that shouldn't exist in normal reality, a manifestation that had been deliberately sent through mechanisms the order had learned to manipulate. The specific details of his death were brutal, designed not just to eliminate him, but to traumatize Heather, to shatter the stability Harry had spent 16 years building, to trigger the kind of psychological crisis that would make Heather vulnerable to what Claudia intended. Heather returned home to find Harry's body. The scene was impossible to process through normal frameworks. Her father killed by something that physics and biology said couldn't exist. His death clearly not random violence, but targeted assassination. The impossibility of the situation forcing Heather to confront that everything Harry had been protecting her from was real and had finally caught up with them. In that moment of absolute trauma, watching Harry's blood pool on floors where they'd lived quietly for months, Heather's suppressed memories began breaking through in force. She remembered Alessa, not as abstract knowledge or distant history, but as lived experience. The burning, the 7 years of torture, the desperate psychic scream that had called her other half back to Silent Hill. She remembered being Cheryl, remembered the split, remembered existing as two separate people who were really fragments of a single consciousness. And she remembered what she was carrying inside her, the fragment of divinity that the order wanted to use, the seed of God that Alessa had split during that final confrontation in 1983, but which had never been fully destroyed, only divided between the twin infants, with the more supernatural portion having been absorbed into Heather's consciousness during the reunification. Claudia revealed herself to Heather in the aftermath of Harry's murder, not with threats or violence, but with an invitation framed as inevitability. Silent Hill was calling Heather home. The town wanted her back. The power inside her demanded completion. She could resist and die slowly as the entity within her tore her apart from the inside, or she could come to Silent Hill, embrace her purpose, and transform her suffering into salvation for all humanity. Claudia presented this as compassion, as offering Heather agency in a situation where she had none, as providing meaning to pain that would occur regardless. Heather, operating on rage and grief and the desperate need to make Harry's death mean something, decided to go to Silent Hill, not to cooperate with the Order. She had no intention of birthing their god, but to destroy them, to end the cult that had killed her father, to finish what Alessa had started in 1983 but hadn't been able to complete. The reunified memories gave Heather understanding of Silent Hill's mechanisms that she hadn't possessed before. She knew how the town worked, knew what the Order wanted, knew her own capabilities in ways that childhood ignorance had previously obscured. She would return to Silent Hill, confront Claudia, and ensure the Order never threatened anyone again. The journey back to Silent Hill triggered full activation of Heather's abilities. As she approached the town, the boundaries between her current identity and her past selves continued dissolving. Heather, Cheryl, and Alessa weren't separate people anymore. They were three names for the same consciousness, three versions of someone who'd been broken and reunified, who carried memories of multiple lives despite having lived only 17 years. The power inside her responded to proximity, to Silent Hill, growing stronger and more difficult to control. The fragment of divinity recognizing its origin point and trying to complete the birth process that had been interrupted. Silent Hill itself had evolved in the 16 years since Harry's escape. The otherworld manifestations had become more sophisticated, more responsive to individual psychology, more capable of generating personalized hells tailored to whoever entered the town. The fog had deepened, the rust had spread, and the creatures that inhabited the nightmare realm had multiplied and diversified. But the core mechanism remained the same. Silent Hill read people, scanned them for guilt and trauma, and manifested external representations of internal damage. For Heather, returning to Silent Hill meant entering a place that could perceive every layer of her fragmented identity, that recognized her as both victim and vessel, that responded to her presence with manifestations drawn from Alessa's memories of suffering. The Order had prepared for her return. Claudia had positioned cult members throughout Silent Hill, ready to guide Heather toward the locations where the birth ritual could be completed. But Claudia had also prepared psychological weapons, evidence of suffering she could deploy to convince Heather that birthing God was necessary. She would show Heather the town's accumulated pain, demonstrate humanity's capacity for cruelty, argue that only divine intervention could end the cycle of violence that produced places like Silent Hill. Every manifestation Heather encountered, every monster she fought, every victim she discovered, all of it would be framed as evidence that the world needed salvation, that Heather's suffering could purchase paradise, that accepting her role as God-bearer was the only moral choice. But Heather had advantages Claudia hadn't fully anticipated. The reunified consciousness gave her access to Alessa's knowledge of the Order's methods, understanding of how their rituals worked, awareness of the weaknesses in their theology, and Harry's 16 years of preparation had given her practical skills, survival instincts, psychological resilience, refusal to accept that her suffering must serve someone else's purpose. Heather wasn't the traumatized 7-year-old that Dahlia had burned. She was 17, hardened by constant relocation and enforced secrecy, carrying rage that gave her strength rather than breaking her down. The confrontation between Heather and Claudia became a battle of wills as much as physical struggle. Claudia deployed every theological argument the Order had developed across centuries, every justification for why Heather should accept pregnancy with a divine entity, every promise of paradise that would follow if she simply stopped resisting what her body wanted to do naturally. She showed Heather visions of a purified world, a reality without suffering, heaven made physical through sufficient sacrifice. She argued that Harry's death could be given meaning if Heather used it as motivation to save everyone else from similar pain. Heather rejected every argument. She'd learned from Alessa's memories that the Order's promises were lies, that their paradise was built on torture, that their God demanded human suffering as the price of existence. She'd seen what happened to people the Order deemed useful. Lisa Garland forced to tend Alessa's burned body, children at Wish House subjected to systematic abuse, countless victims consumed by a cult that framed cruelty as holy necessity. Whatever power she carried, whatever potential she represented, Heather refused to let the Order use her the way they'd used Alessa. The final confrontation occurred in locations throughout Silent Hill that held significance to both Alessa's memories and the Order's operations. Heather fought through otherworld manifestations that grew increasingly desperate as Claudia recognized her theological arguments weren't working. The cult deployed physical force, Order members attempting to restrain Heather, to force compliance through violence since persuasion had failed. And they attempted to trigger the birth prematurely, using rituals designed to accelerate the entity's development, to bring it to consciousness before Heather could find ways to resist. But Heather had learned from Alessa's final act in 1983. If the God entity inside her couldn't be destroyed, it could be expelled. Using techniques she remembered from the original split and the subsequent division of the divine twins, Heather forced the entity out of her body before it reached the development stage necessary for sustainable existence. The thing that emerged was incomplete, malformed, powerful but not invincible, divine potential that hadn't finished incubating, birthed prematurely in a way that ensured it couldn't survive long enough to accomplish what the Order intended. Claudia, in a desperate attempt to salvage the situation, tried to take the dying God entity into herself, to become its vessel, to complete the birth using her own body as the necessary sacrifice. But the entity was too damaged, too far from completion to be saved even through willing acceptance. It died, dissolving back into whatever realm it had come from, taking Claudia with it in a death that witnesses described as simultaneously peaceful and horrifying. A woman achieving her life's purpose while being consumed by the very divinity she'd devoted herself to birthing. Heather left Silent Hill having accomplished what she'd come to do. The Order was shattered, not destroyed entirely, but sufficiently damaged that they wouldn't pose immediate threat. Claudia's death had removed their most competent leadership. The failed birth had demonstrated that even willing vessels couldn't guarantee success if the vessel had sufficient power to resist at critical moments. And Heather had proven that the reunified Alessa Cheryl consciousness was stronger than the fragments had been, capable of resisting manipulation that might have worked on either half separately. But the victory came with cause. Harry was dead, and no amount of Order destruction would bring him back. Heather was left truly alone for the first time, without the parent who'd protected her for 16 years, forced to navigate a world where she knew the supernatural existed and knew she carried power that would always make her a target. The memories of being Alessa, of being Cheryl, of being Heather, all of them coexisting in a single consciousness, created identity confusion that would take years to fully integrate. And Silent Hill remained, fog-shrouded and waiting, a place where the barriers between worlds stayed thin, where guilt continued to manifest as punishment, where people carrying sufficient psychological damage would forever be drawn to face personalized hells. James Sunderland and the Architecture of Personal Guilt, 2001. While Heather's story represented direct continuation of the timeline established through Alessa's suffering and the Order's machinations, Silent Hill had long since evolved beyond being merely the cult's tool, the town's mechanism for manifesting personalized nightmares based on psychological damage operated independently of the order's existence or intentions. Anyone carrying sufficient guilt, anyone haunted by trauma they couldn't resolve, anyone whose psychological damage reached critical thresholds, all of them were susceptible to Silent Hill's pull, drawn toward the town by forces they didn't understand and couldn't resist. James Sunderland exemplified this pattern. He arrived in Silent Hill in 2001, approximately a year after Heather's confrontation with Claudia, having received a letter from his wife Mary asking him to meet her in their special place, in the resort town where they'd vacationed years earlier. The letter made no sense by any rational analysis. Mary was dead, had been dead for 3 years, succumbed to a terminal illness that had transformed James's wife from vibrant partner into bedridden burden, whose final months had been characterized by pain that no medication fully alleviated and deterioration that forced James to watch someone he loved waste away while being powerless to help. But James came to Silent Hill anyway, driven by desperate hope that the letter might be real, that Mary might somehow be alive, that he might be given a chance to see her again. He told himself this was possible, that stranger things had happened, that he needed to investigate rather than dismiss the letter as hallucination or cruel prank. But beneath this rationalization lived truth that James couldn't consciously acknowledge. Guilt was pulling him toward Silent Hill, the weight of what he'd done creating psychological gravity that the town could detect and exploit. Because Mary hadn't simply died from her illness. James had killed her. In her final days, when pain had made her cruel, when suffering had transformed her personality into something unrecognizable, when James's role as caretaker had become unbearable, and his resentment toward her for being sick had grown impossible to suppress. In that moment of absolute crisis, James had taken a pillow and pressed it over Mary's face until she stopped breathing. He'd told himself this was mercy, that he was ending her suffering, that she'd wanted to die and he was simply helping her achieve what the illness would accomplish eventually. But mercy was rationalization. The truth was simpler and more terrible. James had killed Mary because he wanted her dead, because he couldn't endure one more day of caring for someone who'd become a burden, because he'd needed his life back, and murder was faster than waiting for disease to finish its work. He'd hidden this truth from himself immediately after the act, rewritten his memories to transform murder into natural death, convinced himself that Mary had simply died in her sleep as a result of her condition. The false memory was strong enough that James consciously believed it, had spent 3 years accepting that his wife died from illness, with him by her side, grieving like a proper widower should grieve. But unconscious awareness remained, buried deep enough to avoid conscious recognition, but powerful enough to generate the crushing guilt that Silent Hill could perceive from whatever distance separated the town from James's home. The Silent Hill that James entered was different from the one Heather had navigated a year earlier. The town responded to individual psychology, generated manifestations tailored to specific guilt, and what James carried inside him produced a version of Silent Hill distinct from Alessa's nightmare or Heather's confrontation, where Alessa's trauma had generated creatures suggesting childhood vulnerability and victimization, where Heather's rage had manifested as aggressive entities reflecting her desire to fight back. James's guilt produced manifestations centered on sexuality, punishment, and the complicated relationship between love and violence. The creatures James encountered were explicitly sexual in ways that reflected his psychological damage. Lying figures, humanoid shapes wrapped in what appeared to be flesh or fabric, writhing in positions suggesting both suffering and eroticism, vomiting acid as if trying to expel something toxic from within themselves. Mannequins, pairs of legs fused together in configurations that transform the human form into something simultaneously attractive and grotesque, suggestion of sexuality without actual bodies, objectification made literal, pyramid head, the most significant manifestation, a hulking figure wearing a massive triangular helmet, carrying an enormous blade, existing as physical embodiment of James's need for punishment, his unconscious desire to be caught and condemned for what he'd done to Mary. These manifestations weren't random. Silent Hill had read James's psychology, identified the specific configuration of his guilt, murder of his wife intertwined with sexual frustration from 3 years of caring for someone too sick for physical intimacy, resentment toward Mary for being ill mixed with self-hatred for resenting her, and underneath it all the suppressed memory of the pillow pressed over her face, the moment when love and hate had become indistinguishable. The town generated external representations of internal damage, forcing James to confront through physical encounter what he couldn't acknowledge psychologically. James's journey through Silent Hill followed patterns established by the town's mechanism, but tailored specifically to his psychology. He encountered other people trapped in their own versions of Silent Hill, each experiencing manifestations generated by their individual guilt. Angela Roscoe, running from memories of sexual abuse and patricide, seeing a Silent Hill consumed by flames that represented the hell her father had created in her childhood home. Eddie Dombrowski, fleeing consequences of violence he'd committed, encountering a Silent Hill where every person looked like those who'd mocked or threatened him, justifying his own cruelty by framing it as self-defense against a hostile world. These encounters demonstrated how Silent Hill operated on multiple levels simultaneously. Each person experienced their own personalized nightmare, saw manifestations tailored to their specific guilt, navigated a version of the town filtered through their individual psychology, but they could still interact, still perceive each other, still occupy the same physical space, even while experiencing different versions of it. Silent Hill existed simultaneously a single location and multiple personalized hells, reality fractured into as many nightmare realms as there were damaged consciousnesses to perceive them. James also encountered figures that appeared to be Mary, or rather, manifestations that wore her shape while embodying different aspects of his relationship with her. Maria, who looked exactly like Mary, but dressed provocatively and acted flirtatiously, representing the vital sexual partner Mary had been before illness destroyed her personality and body. This manifestation followed James through Silent Hill, offering companionship and suggesting the possibility of romantic connection, embodying what James had lost when Mary became sick and what he'd wanted to reclaim badly enough to commit murder. But Maria died repeatedly, killed by Pyramid Head in scenes that forced James to watch the woman he loved, desired being destroyed over and over. Punishment through repetition, reinforcement of the truth he'd been hiding from himself. Throughout this journey, James pieced together fragments of truth about what had really happened in Mary's final days. Clues accumulated, items that jogged suppressed memories, encounters that forced confrontation with psychological realities he'd been avoiding, manifestations that made explicit what he'd kept unconscious. The videotape showing the hospital room where Mary died, recording equipment positioned to capture the moment, evidence preserved in a format James couldn't dismiss as imagination or false memory. The realization came gradually, each piece of evidence breaking down another layer of the false narrative he'd constructed. until finally James was forced to acknowledge what he'd done. Not mercy killing, not assisted suicide, but murder born from selfish desire to be free of a burden that love should have made him willing to carry forever. The climax of James' story came in confrontation with multiple manifestations, representing different aspects of his guilt and the choices he faced regarding how to process it. Pyramid head, or rather two pyramid heads. The punishment doubled, positioned as executioners that James could either fight or accept. Maria transformed into a monstrous form that combined Mary's face with flesh and metal body, suggesting both sexuality and suffering. Embodiment of how James had reduced his wife to object, how his need for her death had corrupted his ability to love her properly. And through all of this, recordings of Mary's voice, messages she left in her final days, evidence that even in terminal illness she'd understood what James was feeling, that she'd forgiven him before he'd actually committed the act that required forgiveness. Complicated truth that guilt and mercy and love and murder weren't as distinguishable as James wanted them to be. The resolution of James's story depended on choices made throughout his journey, how he responded to manifestations, how he treated Maria, whether he focused on self-preservation or self-destruction, whether he could accept truth about what he'd done while still recognizing the love that had existed before illness destroyed it. Multiple possible endings reflected different psychological outcomes. James accepting guilt and choosing suicide. James acknowledging truth but deciding to continue living. James becoming so lost in delusion that he transformed Maria into substitute for Mary and left Silent Hill believing he'd been reunited with his wife. James being consumed completely by guilt and absorbed into Silent Hill's accumulated suffering. What remained consistent across these endings was that James had come to Silent Hill because his guilt had made him susceptible to the town's mechanism. The letter from Mary, whether genuine supernatural communication or hallucination generated by James's own need to be caught, had served as excuse for journey that his psychology demanded. Silent Hill had read his guilt, generated appropriate manifestations, and forced confrontation with truth that James had been hiding from himself. Whether he achieved resolution or succumbed to the horror depended on psychological factors that the town could influence but not fully control. James's story also demonstrated that Silent Hill's power operated independently of the order's theology or intentions. Claudia and Dahlia had understood the town as tool for birthing God, as location where divine power could be channeled through properly prepared vessels. But the town's fundamental mechanism, reading damaged consciousness and manifesting external representations of internal guilt, worked on anyone carrying sufficient psychological weight, regardless of whether the order was involved or even aware. Silent Hill was more than the cult's instrument. It was an autonomous system for processing guilt, a place where trauma became architecture, where the suppressed became manifest, where people were forced to confront what they'd done, whether they wanted to or not. Walter Sullivan and the 21 Sacraments, 1976 to 2004. While James's encounter with Silent Hill represented guilt operating through the town's established mechanisms, other forces had been accumulating in parallel to the events surrounding Alessa and the Order's machinations. Walter Sullivan's story intersected with the broader Silent Hill timeline in ways that suggested the town's influence extended beyond its geographic boundaries, that sufficient exposure to its power could transform consciousness in ways that persisted across years and even death itself. Walter Sullivan was born in 1970, approximately 6 years before Alessa's burning, in room 302 of an apartment complex outside Silent Hill proper. His mother, forced by circumstances into a desperate situation, gave birth alone in that room, and then abandoned the infant, leaving him to be discovered by authorities who transferred him into the care of Wish House Orphanage. This meant Walter's earliest years were spent under the order's direct control, subjected to the same systematic psychological abuse and occult conditioning that the cult inflicted on all children who passed through their institution. But Walter's conditioning went beyond the standard Wish House treatment. He was selected by the order for a specific purpose, to serve as vessel for a particular ritual they'd been developing based on their understanding of numerology, sacrifice, and how suffering could be transformed into supernatural power. The sect of the Holy Mother, operating from Wish House during the years before authorities shut the facility down, identified Walter as ideal for this role due to his abandonment trauma, his lack of external attachments, and his natural sensitivity to the other world that made him susceptible to order influence. They taught Walter to worship room 302, the location of his birth, the place where his mother had left him, the site of his original abandonment. Through careful psychological manipulation, they convinced Walter that the room was his true mother, that it possessed consciousness and loved him unconditionally, that returning to it was the only way he could achieve the belonging that human relationships had denied him. This theology transformed Walter's abandonment trauma into religious devotion, gave his suffering purpose through the order's framework, and positioned him as willing participant in their plans rather than unwilling victim. The ritual the order taught Walter was called the 21 Sacraments, a sequence of murders that, if performed correctly according to specific rules, would allow Walter to birth a new reality, to transform room 302 into a paradise that existed outside normal space, to achieve union with the mother who'd birthed and abandoned him. The theology underlying this ritual drew from the order's accumulated knowledge about how trauma could be weaponized, how consciousness could be manipulated across boundaries between life and death, and how Silent Hill's reality warping properties could be channeled, even at a distance, through properly prepared vessels. Walter began preparing for the ritual in adolescence, studying the requirements, identifying potential victims, waiting for the moment when circumstances would align properly for the first sacrament. The murders needed to follow specific patterns. 10 hearts taken from victims representing particular symbolic categories, 10 more victims killed through different methods, and finally Walter himself dying as the 21st victim to complete the sequence. Each murder would serve as sacrifice that powered the ritual, accumulated spiritual weight that would eventually reach critical mass necessary for reality transformation. In 1996, when Walter was 26 years old, he began performing the ritual. The murders occurred across several years, following the prescribed sequence, each victim selected according to the symbolic requirements the order had specified. Victims included a man stabbed while trapped in a cage, symbolic imprisonment; a woman killed while drowning in darkness, symbolic purification through water; specific individuals whose deaths represented conceptual categories necessary for the ritual's completion. Walter performed each murder with ritualistic precision, adhering to the order's specifications, believing completely in the theology they'd taught him. The murders attracted police attention, but Walter remained elusive until he was finally cornered in what authorities believed would be his arrest, but which Walter understood as necessary step in the ritual sequence. He committed suicide, or rather, he performed the self-murder that served as one of the 21 sacraments, his death serving a sacrifice that would allow him to continue the ritual from beyond normal life, operating as ghost or consciousness unbound by physical constraints that normally limited the dead. What authorities didn't understand was that Walter's death wasn't an ending, but a transition. The ritual he'd been performing had actually worked, had accumulated enough spiritual weight through his murders to warp reality around room 302, to transform it into a space that existed partially outside normal geometric constraints, to make it into a location where Walter could continue existing and where he could complete the final sacraments necessary for the ritual's culmination. By 2004, 8 years after Walter's physical death, the effects of his ritual had reached critical intensity. Room 302, now occupied by Henry Townsend, a man with no connection to Walter or the order, had become the focal point for completion of the 21 sacraments. The room was simultaneously normal apartment and supernatural space, existing in physical reality while also serving as anchor point for the reality Walter was attempting to birth. Henry found himself trapped, unable to leave through normal means, forced to navigate alternate realities, access through a hole that appeared in his bathroom, confronting manifestations generated by Walter's consciousness and the accumulated trauma of his victims. The victims Walter had killed in the physical world between 1996 and his suicide had become ghosts bound to the ritual, unable to move on, existing as entities that haunted the spaces Walter created. They appeared as manifestations that combined their human identities with the violence that had killed them, neither fully alive nor completely dead, trapped in the same liminal state Walter himself occupied. Henry encountered these victims throughout his journey, tried to help them find peace, discovered that their suffering was fueling Walter's ritual, and that preventing the ritual's completion required somehow freeing them from the cycle Walter had trapped them in. The cosmology underlying Walter's ritual demonstrated how the order's theology had evolved beyond simple God birthing toward more sophisticated understanding of how reality could be manipulated through proper application of trauma and sacrifice. The 21 sacraments weren't attempting to channel divine power through a single vessel the way Dahlia had tried with Alessa. Instead, the ritual distributed the necessary spiritual weight across multiple victims, accumulated power through sequence rather than intensity, and used Walter himself as conduit rather than vessel, his death allowing him to exist as consciousness that could manipulate reality from position outside normal life and death constraints. Silent Hill itself played an ambiguous role in Walter's ritual. The town wasn't directly involved in the murders, which occurred at various locations far from Silent Hill's geographic boundaries. But Walter's conditioning at Wish House had exposed him to Silent Hill's power during formative years, had taught him to perceive and manipulate the other world, had given him tools for reality manipulation that he applied toward purposes the Order had programmed into him. The ritual demonstrated that Silent Hill's influence could extend beyond the town itself through sufficiently prepared vessels, that the reality warping properties could be channeled remotely by those who understood the mechanisms. Henry's confrontation with Walter occurred across multiple realities that the ritual had created, versions of locations from Walter's past, manifestations of his psychological damage made architectural, spaces that combined memory with nightmare with genuine, supernatural alteration of physical reality. The apartment building where room 302 existed became maze that defied normal geometry, contained forests and hospitals and churches that shouldn't fit within its physical structure, served as condensed representation of Walter's entire life and the trauma that had motivated his murders. The resolution of Walter's story came through Henry's choices about how to handle the victims Walter had bound to his ritual. if Henry could free them, if he could help them find peace and break their connection to the cycle Walter had trapped them in, the ritual might be disrupted before completion. But if the victims remained bound, if their suffering continued fueling the mechanism Walter had created, the 21 sacraments would complete, and room 302 would fully transform into the paradise Walter believed awaited him. Though whether such transformation would actually provide the union with his mother that he desired, or simply lock him into nightmare of his own creation, remained ambiguous. Multiple endings reflected different outcomes based on Henry's success at freeing victims and preventing final sacraments. In some versions, Walter completed the ritual, achieved his transformation, and room 302 became permanently warped space where he existed in terrible isolation. In others, Henry disrupted the sequence, prevented completion, but couldn't fully undo what Walter had already accomplished, leaving room 302 damaged and dangerous even after Walter's defeat. And in the most successful outcome, Henry managed to free enough victims to weaken the ritual while also confronting Walter directly in what passed for final combat with consciousness that was already dead, achieving resolution that allowed both victims and Walter himself to finally move on from the cycle that had trapped them. Walter's story demonstrated several crucial elements about how Silent Hill's power operated in the broader timeline. First, that exposure to the town's influence during formative years could create individuals capable of manipulating reality even at a distance, that the Order's conditioning could produce vessels who carried fragments of Silent Hill's power wherever they went. Second, that rituals based on trauma and sacrifice could actually work, could generate real supernatural effects if performed with sufficient understanding and commitment, that the Order's theology wasn't entirely delusion, but represented genuine understanding of how consciousness and reality intersected in ways that defied normal physical laws. And third, that the consequences of such rituals persisted even after the originators died, that Walter's death hadn't ended what he'd started, but simply shifted it into different phase, that trauma weaponized through proper techniques created effects that outlasted the individuals who initiated them. By 2004, when Henry finally achieved whatever resolution his choices produced, Silent Hill's influence had spread far beyond the town's geographic boundaries through multiple vectors. Heather carried fragments of divine power wherever she went, marked by her origin and unable to escape completely even after defeating Claudia. James had either died in Silent Hill or left, carrying guilt that would shape the rest of his life, his encounter with the town having forced confrontation with truth, but not necessarily providing healing. And Walter's ritual had demonstrated that the Order's teachings could produce individuals who carried Silent Hill's reality warping properties into locations that had never been near the town itself, that the influence was viral, spreading through prepared vessels, infecting new spaces with the accumulated trauma that Silent Hill processed. The timeline wasn't finished. Other stories would unfold, some before the events already described, flashbacks showing earlier encounters with the town's power, some parallel to established events, revealing what was happening in other locations while Alessa burned or Heather confronted Claudia. But by 2004, the fundamental patterns had been established. Silent Hill existed as mechanism for processing guilt, responded to psychological damage by manifesting personalized nightmares, and had created a legacy that extended beyond its boundaries through the people it marked and the powers it granted to those who understood how to channel its influence. The town remained fog-shrouded and patient, waiting for the next damaged consciousness to approach its boundaries, carrying sufficient guilt to trigger the mechanisms that had been refined across centuries. The order survived in diminished but persistent form, preserving their theology, learning from their failures, preparing for whatever opportunity might next present itself. And the victims, those who'd encountered Silent Hill and lived, those who carried fragments of its power, those who'd been marked by exposure to trauma that defied normal reality, continued existing in a world where they knew the supernatural was real, where they understood that guilt could become physical, and where they recognized that places like Silent Hill would always exist as long as humans carried unresolved damage that demanded manifestation.